Welcome to my session. My name is Kevin Dunn. I work for a company called ISEC Partners. I love doing events here in Austin where I live. This is a sea of faces that I know several people in here. It's like talking to a family, which is always both good and bad, I guess. So yes, welcome to my session. Breach assessments. Are you owned? You can find out. I've been a security consultant for about 12 years. I've worked mostly on the attack and penetration side for the majority of that. Recently, I have been asked to do more incident response work over the last couple of years. And that's been a pretty interesting transition, able to see the results of the types of things that we do on the attack and pen side actually happening in enterprises. And I wanted to talk to you about this idea of breach assessment, assessing your susceptibility and determining whether you've actually been owned in one way or another. I came in late to the previous presentation where Josh and Walter, I think, were talking about how they tackle it in their company. And there will be some overlap between what I have and what they have. But the vector, or the difference here, I think, is that I don't work for any one company. I get brought into lots of companies to look at what's happening to them in that kind of snapshot in time. And this is definitely the fruits of that. So originally, it was myself and another person on my team doing this presentation. But as in kind of perfect timing mode, he got called away to do a breach, or to investigate a breach. So it's just me, I'm afraid. So which way is it? That way. OK, so the subtitle of my presentation, Are You Owned? You Can Find Out. Part of this is around just making sure you have some elite speak in your presentation title. It clearly worked. There's a bunch of people here. But the kind of undertone to this is you can find out, or can you? Because the challenges around doing this, as was touched on a little bit in the previous talk, can be pretty difficult. So this is kind of like an overview of the trends that I've seen and some advice based upon that. And hopefully you'll find it useful. So let's start at the beginning. So you want to do IR. Who in here does active incident response, either internally or externally? Yeah, a few people, great. Well, let's just really quickly start off with what incident response looks like to most people. This diagram is a pretty well-known diagram in the incident response space. It comes from the NIST Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. And most people base their incident response mechanisms around this in some way, or an elaborated or expanded version of it. Even if you train with people like SANS or something, and you do like their newer courses like 4508, it's basically based on this, but they have 6 steps because they've expanded it. So if you're not familiar with incident response as a broad subject, then you could do a lot worse than looking in this guide. The NIST guide is pretty all-encompassing and useful. These are some examples of IR activities that I might get involved with a company. Ultimately, if I was doing a broader IR discussion with you today, I'd probably talk about all of these. But obviously, what we're going to focus on is this idea of breach assessment, trying to analyze what's happened in your environment and work out, what actions or consequences you need to take. But in the broader world, we might be looking at this kind of thing: developing an incident response plan, conducting an incident response readiness review, live breach assessment. So actually, as something's happening, post-intrusion analysis, so after the fact, trying to understand what's happened after the fact. Forensics and malware analysis is a big part of this process if you do the full cycle. And obviously, you have specialisms and specialists that get involved in various things. And then this concept of developing your own SOC, Security Operations Center. And obviously, not everybody needs their own SOC, but everyone probably needs SOC-like activities within their organization. So who's developed an incident response plan in this room? Show of hands. Yep, great. Who's done an incident response readiness review? I guess it would be the people that either do or don't have that plan, testing that plan, right? It's kind of interesting to see what happens, right, when you take the theory and try to put it into practice. But let's start with this concept of just what is a breach assessment? For the purposes of this, this discussion, this session, we'll say that it's an activity that you can do in either a proactive or a reactive way. Essentially, it's this: searching for evidence of current or previous compromise on your enterprise network. Sounds easy, right? This, stolen diagram number 1 shows me, or number 2, shows you that the idea here is that this can either be proactive or reactive. You're either doing this to try to understand what your capabilities are in incident response, or you're being forced to do it because you're under attack. But really, all I wanted to show here is that when all's said and done and the dust settles, and hopefully there wasn't too much dust, you actually get this kind of thing out of it, right? You find out how ready you were for a breach. Doing it proactively is obviously better than finding out reactively. Breach assessments, though, within any organization are a process that you'll definitely change. You'll have to adapt, right? You'll have to change based upon what you need to look at and what's happening. So we don't probably want to get hung up too much on what the categories are of activity that you might do for a breach assessment, but it's definitely worth us kind of trying to understand from a high level what it is. You need to, as people that work for organizations in a blue team capacity or in a security risk management capacity or whatever you may be, you need to do this kind of idea. You need to understand your external baseline. What do things look like in your organization on any normal day, if there is such a thing? Understand your internal baseline. Only by doing this are you going to really recognize when something's wrong, right? Searching for anomalous behavior is essentially what a breach assessment is. That's the process, really. Working out if a machine is behaving in a suspicious way, or working out if traffic looks suspicious or looks malicious. We look at traffic hitting key assets, and we look at traffic leaving your organization. These are really the key areas that we often see evidence of potential compromise. So we're all in this industry because we understand the need for security. Obviously, we feel threatened in a number of ways when it comes to security. But it's worth understanding that the threats really, and the motivations of your threat actors are going to dictate the kinds of things that you will see in the form of an attack. This is my attempt to try and define motivation for attackers. We're all smart people. We could probably add a couple to this, but this seems like a reasonable place to start. Attackers motivated by money, those that are motivated by data, those that are motivated by control, and those that are motivated by damage. Attackers motivated by money, this may be the kind of commodity malware style attacks and infections that you see, things like Bitcoin mining, clickjacking, botnets, these types of things, things that can have a direct monetary gain for a criminal, money being the motivation. Attackers that are motivated by data, however, that may be because they want to take some data out of your business process for competitive intelligence reasons, or brand damage, or whatever, expose, whatever it might be. The types of attacks that they may be trying to pull off against you are going to be probably slightly different. We may see less malware involved in that. Maybe we're moving more into the human activity, the HUMACT area. But maybe not. Maybe malware is still being used. Attackers motivated by control, this is really down to a more sophisticated threat, I would suggest, that is in some way trying to get into your business process and take control of it. Anyone from the ICS sector here? I mean, that's obviously kind of a big thing that we worry about, control of power plants and substations and all that kind of thing. But it may be not that, right? You may be in the financial sector or any of the any vertical that you can think of. If I can take control of your business process, well, it's probably a bad thing for you because I can influence it. I'm not going to help you via my influence. Damage is the one that we're most familiar with from the angle of hacktivists, right? DDoS, defacement, these types of things. We also have a new kind of or emerging area of scorched earth or salted earth style attacks where data's deleted, nothing will ever grow here again type ideas. So unfortunately we have to worry about those as well. So from a high level, obviously we understand threats exist, But how do they get into your organization? I mean, there are going to be tons of ways, right? I've come up with a couple of slides here that, again, are my best guess at entry points. I've tried to cover all of them if I can, but again, I'm sure there are others. These are definitely more in the category of things that I would call accidental entry points versus deliberate. So users browsing to malicious websites. We all have users in our organization. That's really the part of the problem. We can't really control what they try to do, or rather we can, but do we? They may browse to malicious websites accidentally. They may have content on websites that are not malicious, that's linked from malicious sources, all these types of ideas. User traffic and user browsing habits are going to be a lot of the things that you're looking at and investigating when you do breach assessments. And it's also where a lot of your false positives are going to come from. I spent a long time chasing my way down a rabbit hole that was just basically, from a traffic perspective, created because a user was looking at eBay and the images that were on eBay were sourced from various countries that made it look kind of suspicious from a pure traffic analysis perspective. So definitely bear this in mind. User receives a malicious email. I would say most of the attacker modeled pen tests that I do, where we have to model a real threat in some way, if the brief is just to get onto the network, and physical attacks aside, phishing is probably the way that we always do it from an attacker perspective when we're doing pen tests. So needless to say, we're in a situation where we have to accept that your users are going to click on things and run things that were sent to them. That's going to be one of the main entry points that you may see for malware or for persistent threat kind of idea. User accessing peer-to-peer file sharing. Well, this may be a slight tenuous link to accidental, but they certainly didn't mean to cause you a problem. Ultimately, they're just touching areas of the web that we probably can associate with problems. User introduces malware via USB stick. This one isn't a problem anymore, right? Because you've all found ways to stop this happening in your organization. Nobody can use USB sticks anymore, right? It's totally sewn up. British humor doesn't count. Okay. Yeah, USB infection vectors are still a problem, right? Everyone seems to imagine that, with the demise of auto-run and what have you, this isn't a problem. But if you follow the security industry like we do, we know that there are tons of USB infection vectors that are going to be an issue for you. Obviously, we have to talk significantly about the deliberate entry point idea, and this is really all based around attacks, right? User attacks the corporate IT systems, user attacks internally, and user attacks them externally. Notice I'm saying user here, though. I'm referring to your workforce in these first 2 points, or at least somebody who appears to be from your workforce. The last point is obviously more traditional idea. Third-party aggressor attacks your corporate IT from the inside or the outside. This is the hacker threat. Stolen diagram number 3, right? If we have to imagine an organization in its most simple form, I would love to say circa 2002, but pretty much this is still what it looks like for most organizations, right? We have the big red threat of the internet. We have the classic DMZ setup, and we have the corporate environment. When you're considering threats here, this may be your traditional border, if you will, and you may have embarked on a brave new world of cloud computing, and maybe your border looks like something I couldn't draw right now. But ultimately, without that, this may be what we're looking at. Outer edge firewall, inner edge firewall. Which firewall contains the most important logs for me from a breach assessment perspective? It depends on the threat, right? This one's going to certainly probably have the bigger logging pool because it's the thing that's getting bombarded by traffic from the internet every second of every minute of every hour of every day. This one, though, is the one that's probably going to be able to see egress attempts from your organization. Egress attempts are really the thing that you should be focusing on if you're trying to chase malware, C2, data egress, all those types of things. This guy is incredibly important. I'm sure everybody gets that. So if this is the border, we have to also imagine the internal network looks like this, right? Faceless, brainless users. But actually, from an attacker's perspective, it looks like this, right? Everything is in there. That's what I want. And when I do pen tests, this is the whole point. I need to get into your treasure trove. Whatever the data is, think about the thing that's the most important data in your organization right now, right? It's not on a DMZ server, right? It's on the internal network, clearly. All of these angles, are the things that we need to look at when we're doing a breach assessment. Internal, external, traversal, everything. So, successful breach assessment is essentially telemetry plus aggregation. So telemetry is this idea of sensors, right? IDS, AV, whatever it might be, where you're getting your raw data from. And aggregation is the idea of bringing it all together so that you have a hope of a chance of figuring out what's happening in a reasonable amount of time. You can certainly have sensors without aggregation, but ultimately, how useful will it be to you? Are you able to figure out what's going on? Are you able to do threat correlation? So this idea about telemetry, though, does it need to be yours, or can it be somebody else's? We have seen a trend of like IR-specific firms, right? We can all think of big box IR firms that exist now, or maybe one of them. And they will have a way of looking at this where they will bring in their own equipment and either allow you to manage it or they'll manage it for you. When I first started looking at breach assessments and the idea of breach assessments, I thought this was a really bad idea. I thought this was just kind of a money-making idea. And I assumed that it would be way better to do it with your own telemetry. Boy, was I wrong. It really depends, of course. But for a lot of organizations I go to, and the theme here is going to be around this, they don't have enough data gathering going on for me to be able to give them a reasonable idea of what's happening. Sucks, but it's true. But what do we mean by telemetry? We probably need to have quite a lot of things, right? I don't know what organizations you guys are all from, but I would hazard that you have, these are 2 slides, I would hazard that you have some of these. Maybe you have all of them. But quite a lot of firms that I go into to do IR and breach assessments in, they don't have many of these points. So it's like, what exactly do you want me to do here? So content filtering, tracing website and domain access, basically, as it leaves your organization. Products like WebSense, Barracuda, there are tons, right? This is the thing that users get annoyed at when they try to go to Facebook, and it says, you can't go to Facebook, it's against policy. Well, it's obviously also blocking a lot more than that, and you can define your own policy. So that's quite important. Keeping that list up to date is not just a job for the company that makes it, it's a job for you guys as well when you're defending the network. DNS server logs, these are pretty important as well. And really, depending on your relationship with your ISP or who you use for your DNS, you may or may not be able to get threat intelligence or a notion of what's trying to leave your organization from the DNS level. Antivirus and malware, tracing infected or tracing hosts that are having things happen to them that are unauthorized, effectively. A lot of people in the pen test side of the world, scoff and snort at the idea of endpoint protection because it's almost always bypassable by a determined attacker, which is definitely true. And we do that on pen tests a lot, bypassing endpoint protection so that we can get things to work. However, they can also be the early line of defense, right? If somebody trips them in some way, and maybe application whitelisting is a better example than AV, they're an important part of your Swiss Army knife when it comes to figuring out if something's happening on your network. Vulnerability assessment internally within the organization. Anybody here have an internal enterprise vulnerability assessment platform that they use? They do scanning, yeah, people are nodding. This is becoming more common, and I try to encourage our customers to do that as much as possible, mainly because I don't want to do that work, it's boring. But you should be doing it internally as part of your housekeeping when you're running a network. This is not 15 years ago. You don't need me to come in and run Nessus for you, right? Hopefully not. But when it comes to breach assessment, I want to look at that data because it may give me important ideas about what's happening or what may have happened. If you're like 99% of everybody else in the world, then your internal enterprise is managed by Microsoft Active Directory. Yes, I know you have, that's Bill Gates. He always keeps an eye on me. I know you have other operating systems running. You have Macs, you have Linux, you have Unix, you have dusty stuff that you can't walk next to because it's so flaky. But most of the administration and management in most environments that we walk into, nay, all of them, are AD. So tracing events in Active Directory is pretty important if I want to see some potential malicious activity. However, it's not just about AD, right? I need to trace it at a local host level. I need to understand what's happening on member servers or workstations that aren't, that doesn't represent an action in AD. It's locally. Why? Well, because pen test and hacking activity may not be affecting AD initially. It may be affecting the local machine in some way, account creation, for example. I can't do this work without looking at traffic for anomalies. Now, there are lots of ways to look at traffic. There's lots in terms of like what domains is the traffic going to and what kind of protocol is it. But at some point when you get down into the weeds of trying to analyze a breach, you have to have DPI, right? You have to look at the actual deep packet inspection and see what the request was, what the response was. Is it encrypted? Is it funky? All these types of things. The last area that you almost can't avoid now is forensic capture. Acquisition of the drives or memory capture for hosts that you think have been infected or have been touched in some way. This is an area that you may or may not do internally, but you probably need to do this if you're determined about finding out what the malware was and what it was doing. You may not be. You may have figured out that it's just a very well-known variant of something, and you just clean and move on. Life's too short. It may not be a well-known variant. It may have been a targeted piece of malware that was written just for you. You probably want to know about that. So some examples, content filtering. Like I said, this is an example of some screenshots from Web Sensor. It's not the only one out there. You can see here that it categorizes things very nicely. What I don't like about a lot of these products, though, and another theme that runs through this, is the ability to get data out of it and get data out of it in a fast way. Now, like I said, I don't have the luxury of doing this for one company, for my own company. So I don't have influence on purchasing power or anything like that. So I have to go into firms and really make do with what they've got. Boy, that's tough. Because obviously you will have customers that have a lot and you will have customers that have a little, but they both, examples of those customers both expect the same thing, for us to tell them what on earth happened. DNS, this is an example of OpenDNS. Does anyone use OpenDNS for their ISP? Great, definitely should. They provide threat intelligence on malware domains and things like that, botnet domains. Very good feed. It's useful. AV and malware, two different approaches, right? Semantic endpoint protection down here and FireEye up here. Ultimately, early warning system of somebody trying to run something. This might be more inside a threat that it catches than anything else. FireEye, on the other hand, very good at catching C2, very good at catching beaconing, trying to leave the organization. That's not the only product available, and it's not the only way to do it, but these are examples. Vulnerability assessment, as I mentioned. I particularly like the way that Nexpose does it. This didn't come out very well on the slide, I'm sorry. But Nexpose actually categorizes vulnerabilities in a couple of useful ways. The first one from my red team kind of side is it tells me whether there's a exploit in Metasploit, which is fantastic from the pen test side. The other thing that it can do, though, is it tells you if a vulnerability is known to be used by active malware. That's really cool. If you scan your workstations and you see all these vulnerabilities, then you get an indication of the types of malware that use those vulnerabilities. And therefore, when you are trying to look at a workstation that's doing something crazy and you correlate this stuff together, you can see, this may be because they're not patched against such and such a Java bug or Adobe or whatever it might be. This is only useful, though, if you scan your workstations. A lot of companies that I work with, they do have great enterprise scanning platforms in place, like Nessus or Nexpose, but they scan their servers only. That's not great from the perspective of a breach assessment, because most malware that I'll be looking at and tracing is not happening on servers, hopefully. It's happening more on workstations. So, Active Directory events, these are fantastic. Who uses Splunk in their organization? Excellent. I don't see any T-shirts, though. It's usually T-shirts in the organ. So Splunk's pretty cool, but really this is just an example of us being able to look into what's happening in AD. And I've got some other examples in a bit about the types of things that we do with this, but it's pretty powerful. In fact, on the next slide, I have examples. So remember I talked about this idea of host access anomalies, trying to trace activity that is actually malicious. Now, obviously, this varies depending on what kind of activity you're tracing. If it's malware, we may be looking at beaconing. If it's humact, if it's actual hackers or pen testers or whatever, then we're trying to look for behavioral analysis and anomaly detection based upon what systems are accessing what and what they're asking to do. Analyzing AD is really cool for that. What I have here is an example of just running a query in Splunk with one particular client. And I was there we go. And I was able to look at the use of a particular service account that was a domain admin. I know, none of you have got domain admin service accounts, absolutely not. But let's just say you did. It's quite important for you to understand where those are being used from. Why? Well, because hopefully normal analysis and normal patterns of usage for that account are quite predictable. What hosts are accessing using that account. What I've got here is an example of where you can see it stand out like a sore thumb, right? Corporate-looking workstations, and then a workstation called K3V-NCC-Win. That's me on a pen test. So this type of thing, I'm not saying this is the thing you'll always be able to see, but looking at DHCP logs for like non-standard host names, looking at where particular accounts are being used, AD by itself is not great for that, but data aggregation of that telemetry is where it becomes really powerful. Every like domain admin or enterprise admin or powerful service account you have within your organization, you should be running reports like this on it every day. Where were they logged in from? It'll be a really good indication if someone's owning you. You should at very least, I think, be able to detect your own pen tests, right? Sounds kind of simple, but a lot of the companies that I still to this day that I do network pen tests for internally, during the debrief we always say, so how much of our activity did you detect? And most of the time it's nothing, none, absolutely nothing at all. I would suggest you've got a problem. If you can't even detect that, because we don't typically behave very stealthily, then from a breach assessment perspective, you're going to have bigger issues. General traffic anomalies. This is a screenshot from NetWitness, and there are lots of like telemetry DPI products that can do things like this and break out for you the destination country that a particular host was making requests to over a period of time. This is a single host that's making requests out to pretty much every country that we could write on a list of countries to be worried about when it comes to cyber threats. So when you see this kind of thing, it's like, this is a good place for me to start. If it's a workstation, maybe this is malware. If it's a server, maybe it's malware. But ultimately, these are the types of indicators of compromise that we're looking for within your organization when we come in to do this work. And of course, good old forensic capture. The people here that do IR within their organization, you probably do need to get to this point now and again, either as an exercise for your own internal team or because you are genuinely interested in what was running on that machine to make a machine behave in the way it was. So, good old-fashioned forensic capture and analysis is a good way to do it. If you're in a virtual environment, then obviously it's way easier. But if you're not, you're in a traditional kind of disk environment, then break out the right blockers. It's Christmas. So, great. Telemetry, great. Aggregation, great. What are we actually looking for? Well, here's some examples, and I've talked about some of them already. Malware C2, right? Bidirectional C2. We want to see evidence of hosts that are being communicated and controlled by people outside of your organization. I mean, we don't want to see that, but that's what the breach assessments will probably show. Traditional reverse shells, maybe we'll see some stuff being pushed out. Interestingly, now we're obviously also looking at trying to inspect traffic that is sometimes potentially legitimate. So, when I do pen tests, we often write like custom malware in C2 that does its C2 over Twitter or GitHub or any of these feature-rich websites that you probably do allow your users to access. So depending if we have an indication that something particularly sneaky is going on, then maybe we have to look at that kind of access as well as the blah, blah, blah.ru stuff that we'll see in the logs. Access and destruction, this is really important. So wherever you keep your key data, your most important data, I need to look at the logs on who's accessed that And this is not necessarily about data egress at this point. It's just about which users in your organization have accessed the database with the powerful data in. So that's a good area to look. Encrypted protocols, yes and no. Most of the tunneling we're seeing is just over SSL most of the time. So, but if we saw something non-standard, that would probably be pretty cool, and it would be an indicator of something significant. Obviously, we are still looking at the old kind of stuff of like evidence of application attacks. So if you have logging on your web servers and your database servers, we're looking at, okay, are we seeing an injection vulnerability being exploited? These types of things. And of course, you know, anything against internal servers or servers in general. This really comes down to whether you have the capability in your organization to show me scanning activity or not. What does it look like? Well, yeah, ultimately, it could look like a lot of things, but typically human activity looks different to malware in my experience, so you can have a different kind of pattern to actually follow. One of the things here, I know Josh mentioned it before as well, is about CIF, a collective intelligence framework, about trying to get threat analytics and threat intelligence. My experience of this so far is that the data is really bad, I'm afraid to tell you. I don't know if anybody uses it here, but the IP and domain information that you get, firstly, you just get like domain names or IP addresses. And a lot of the time it's not in date from the perspective of like 85% of what you see in CIF that you'll correlate to, that you'll check like data access to for your particular organization will be like pointing to things like AWS, EC2, all this kind of stuff, right? Obviously, those IPs and those domains have been, you know, recycled about 500 times before I actually went to look at CIF. And at one time in the past, it was hosting something bad, so now it's on a list that says it's bad forever. This is a tough problem. I don't know of particularly great threat intelligence feeds at the moment. I'm really happy to get feedback on any that people are using that they think are good. It's tough, but it will still work, especially if you see a lot of browsing activity or traffic activity from a single host, and they are on CIF in multiple places. But I'm, you know, ultimately saying like just don't use it as kind of like the indicator of definite compromise. Because you'll be raising a lot of alarms for a lot of false positives, in my personal experience. So, you know, just from a high level, case study of typically what we would see for something that looks like malware. We would see requests to quote-unquote odd destinations. This is about, you know, how do you know what destination's odd, though, right? You have to obviously kind of have an understanding first and foremost of your organization's baseline traffic and what people are doing legitimately. And then you can correlate against threat intelligence feeds as well. And then you're looking at things like country-level TLDs and other things. But really, you know, that's probably all you have. And then you have to go deeper. Polling or beaconing of traffic, absolutely. If it's traced back to workstations, this is generally like an indication of one or two things. It's an indication of malware, or it's an indication of a user with bad browsing habits. Which one do you think comes up more? It's usually just the user that's browsing to stuff that they found a way to browse to, and it's not great, you know, or it's linking to content that's not great. The eBay example comes up a lot, you know, images that are being sourced from other areas that, from a kind of TLD perspective or traffic perspective, look bad. You just ultimately can't get away from this idea, though. If you get enough indications of potential compromise, you have to get down to DPI. You have to look at what the traffic was. Because a lot of times the requests stand out really significantly as like an obfuscated request or something like that. And then you can kind of reach out to intelligence feeds like VirusTotal or anything really, or anything that you're doing internally, and work out if that pattern's been seen before. If you have a product like FireEye, it does quite a bit of this for you, but FireEye is ultimately bypassable. We bypass it all the time on pen tests. That's not me saying don't have FireEye, it's just that know its limitations, just like we know AV has limitations and firewalls have limitations and what have you. But you know, you may get to the point where you can't find any information, so you have to do the malware analysis yourself or outsource it. That involves pulling the box in a way that preserves live memory and disk image. Human activity, well, this could be anything, right? DHCP logs are a really good example. Will show you people that have plugged things into your network that are non-standard if you have a standard naming convention for your host names within your organization. that's not, we don't suggest a standard naming convention for host names just because it's annoying. We suggest it because it then allows you to see stuff that doesn't have it. And if I walk onto site, and I deliberately make sure that all of my hosts that I'm using on my pen test are named in a very deliberate way, either with our company name in it or hacker or something like that, because ultimately I want blue team members to bust down the door and ask me what's going on, because they've traced that host back to the wall port that I'm using. Almost never happens. In my entire career, it's only happened once, and they called the police. So that was a communications mistake and a language barrier, I think. You definitely want to find powerful domain accounts, though, that are being used. We all have these kind of difficult family secrets in our network, things that obviously I'm going to tell you, you shouldn't have domain admins being used in that way. I get it, you do, and you're working on it. However, you will know the things in your network that are the problem areas. Those are the things that you almost absolutely have to be logging. Those domain admin accounts, or whatever they are that are being used for service accounts, somebody should know what's happening with that account every minute of the day, right? And you can do that with AD. You can do it with event IDs. If Michael Goff or somebody like that was here, they would tell us all about which event IDs work really well for that. You want to look at odd locations, right? You should have an understanding of what VLANs are useful for what, or what are used for what, rather, within your organization. Workstation VLANs versus server VLANs versus management VLANs. This is a really good telling, or really good indicator of compromise. If something's happening, you should be able to see it based on location. Shares mapped to domain controllers. That's a good one. That's probably me stealing your SAM database or something like that, right? Gratuitous use of PowerShell. I would suggest that's an attacker, not an admin. People that are using PowerShell the most are probably pen testers or attackers. And hopefully it will also be sysadmins more and more. So pretty straightforward, right? Well, obviously not. Wow, I'm running out of time. So 99 problems. Yeah, tons of problems. And this is why I appreciate that I can't just say to you, do all of this. Thank you, good night. It's tough. Cost is a huge thing. I was making suggestions to the types of things that a particular client recently should be logging in their Splunk instance, and they paused and they said, I think it may be cheaper for us to purchase Splunk as a company than do what you're suggesting. Splunk's fantastic, buy Splunk. However, be cognizant of the fact that their licensing model currently means that it can be very difficult to log down and correlate things like create process or something, because the amount of data you are going to have is going to cause you a lot of cost. Knowledge is a big deal. I don't know how significant the blue teams are in your company. In my experience, it's more common, though, to find blue teams that are set up around just looking at logs and just looking at trouble tickets as they come up, but without the concept of understanding threat correlation. What this plus this plus this probably means. That's a knowledge gap thing, unfortunately. And it kind of needs somebody from the red team side and someone that's trained in attacks to be able to piece a lot of that stuff together, which I believe should be the blue team's job. You should have people that know about threat correlation. Data accessibility and data aggregation. Accessibility is a real pain. I end up having to write a lot of Python on the fly to interface with the APIs of telemetry products, if there is an API. If there isn't an API, and it's literally you can only export via a GUI to an Excel spreadsheet, I'm in a really big problem. The number that was being said recently in the last talk was 1 billion flows a day or something like that, right? Try doing that with an Excel spreadsheet, right? Exporting all of that data. So when you're picking your products, you need to have an eye on that. How extensible is it? How interoperable is it? Does it have an API that is fully fledged so that you can get this data out for analysis? When we go into firms, it ranges from yes to don't make me laugh, right? So this is a problem. The speed with which I need to get the data out and analyze it in a post-compromise situation may be just as fast as in a live compromise situation. It really depends on what's happening. Cloud, for anyone who's playing bingo. Yeah, cloud's a problem. Why is cloud a problem? Well, if you're like a lot of companies and you're offsetting quite a bit of your company into the cloud, then good luck getting those logs sometimes. I'm not going to say that's completely always, but sometimes. And good luck getting those disk images, right? So when you're talking to your CSPs and you've got one eye on IR, Find out if they let you get that data. This is an example of Splunk GUI. This is an example of the Logstash Kibana GUI, or is it? I'm not sure. They look pretty similar, right? One is free, one is not free. If you're trying to get into this, but you have budget constraints, and you think that some of these products are too high a bar for you, then take a look at the Elasticsearch stuff, right? Logstash is just phenomenal. It can do, in my experience so far, it can do a lot of the things that Splunk's doing. But with no support, right? So you better be ready to roll up your sleeves. So, is it worth it? Yeah, it's definitely worth doing breach assessments, right? You will find breaches, but you will also find a heck of a lot of false positives. And then the main thing that you'll find out when you do a breach assessment is your gaps. What data did you not have? False positives are an interesting thing. Sheep in wolf's clothing. Remember this host from before that was making all these beaconing requests out to all these foreign countries that made us all, when we were doing the assessment, we were like, got it, this is the one. No, it was an RSA Envision server. It was a security product. Security products often look like malicious products, right? So the RSA Envision server was analyzing a company's firewall probes for all the stuff that was being dropped successfully at the border, and then was doing reverse lookups for all those addresses. That's going to look like a beaconing host, right? So, you know, one of the things that you'll find here is everything looks like a breach when you start looking for breaches, right? The gaps. This is really the big one. A lot of people in the audience, I suspect, that are thinking about their organization will be thinking about what they do and don't have. So if I come and you've asked me to come and do an IR gig and do a breach assessment, I'm going to be saying, okay, where's the data? What data do I have? I'm not cutting fiber and looking into a light, right? I need to actually see, that would have worked, I don't know, bizarre example. I need to actually see the data. So think about it, design it, drill it. Absolutely make sure that this works for you. Consider the compromises and consider the threat actors. So, wrapping up, what's next? You've got to design a solution that will find real attacks. Figure out what the attacks are for your organization. They'll be pretty standard in some cases and specialist in others. And design your telemetry and your IR system, if you will, around that. You ultimately need to test it proactively within your organization. This slide always comes out really weird. Test it soft, drill it hard. But the point is, you need to test it within your organization to make sure it works, and then you need to get somebody else outside of your organization to test it. That's not me upselling, that's me being realistic. Have somebody put your blue team and their sensor system through its paces. It's the only way you're going to figure out if it works. One of my final quotes to haunt everybody is, does your IR plan meet your DR plan? At some point, your breach may be so bad that you have to enact DR-like procedures. We're all used to DR. We're all used to the idea of if a flash flood comes through our data center, we switch over to the other 5 that we've got. But is anyone making that process and policy decision in your organization to have that kind of response to a breach, to an attack? When, you know, if you want to case study stuff for when it really goes bad, you want to look at like Saudi Aramco and Shamu, right? 30,000 workstation hard drives replaced. You all guys have plans for that, right? So, lastly, of course, when's the best time to find out that you were not ready for IR? When you're proactively testing it, not during a live breach, right? Companies do this proactively, and they bring us in to help them with that sometimes, and they bring us in to drill it. There are people doing this proactively. But it might be in the same category of the number of companies that are using honeypots, right? Okay, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.